Hello, I'm Alex Tini, and this is my thesis proposal, U.S. Foreign and Economic Policy Effects Post-1991 on Unipolarity. With the exception of minor international skirmishes, typically pertaining to the protection and defense of U.S. naval assets in international waters, the Spanish-American War of 1898 is considered to be the United States' first major international conflict outside of the continental U.S. territories. Since 1898, the U.S. has largely maintained a policy of international intervention. Between 1945 and 1991, U.S. foreign and economic policies have also largely remained unchanged. The Cold War resulted in a persistent need for foreign state interventionist policies in order to curtail the expansion of the Soviet Union and its allies. International economic policies also fought the communist threat abroad, promoting democracy and capitalism through humanitarian aid and state financial welfare assistance. At the same time, U.S. officials continued to advance policies which encouraged the financing of American spending through perpetual loans from foreign powers. However, after the Cold War, these policies were fortified and expanded upon, rather than dismantled. The communist threat was gone, but the unipolar moment necessitated protection for preservation. At face value, it is logical to conclude that because the policies of the Cold War period coincided with the unipolar rise of the U.S., the continuation and expansion of those 20th century policies would further consolidate and strengthen that position of power in the 21st century. However, there is a growing concern that U.S. power is waning, and other states, particularly China, are beginning their ascent to a level of power worthy of study and focus. The purpose of this thesis is to determine whether or not the U.S. unipolar position is in danger of being undermined, challenged, or replaced altogether. In order to determine whether or not the unipolar moment was but a fleeting instant in modern history, or will become the hegemonic exception, this thesis strives to answer the following question. To what extent have U.S. foreign and economic policies post-1991 preserved or endangered the U.S. unipolar position in the 21st century? The rise in near-peer competitors in the 21st century requires a revision to military strategy and how the United States engages other states politically and economically. Based on IR and economic theories that have been analyzed so far, as well as quantitative economic data, the hypothesis of this thesis is that foreign and economic policies post-1991 will inevitably result in an immense domestic economic crisis, ultimately leading to the decline of U.S. polarity and presenting an opportunity for China to quickly rise as a great power, arguably the great power in Eurasia, within the international system as a whole. So far in the preliminary research of the prevailing literature, there exists a debate between unipolarists or primacists and declinists, as well as debate between unipolarists and multipolarists. The latter debate focusing more so on U.S. power itself, and the former debate focusing more so on the comparative rise of other state powers relative to the United States. There also exists some debate among realists on the importance of economic strength in relation to military strength, with some noting that it is military technological advancements and total strength that truly sets the United States apart from the rest of the world, since other states within the international community are closer in terms of economic strength, but much less capable in terms of military strength. The primacist school of thought seems to be the dominant and most prevalent of unipolar literature. Charles Krauthammer introduces the theory in The Unipolar Moment and correctly predicts the decades-long U.S. period of dominance. Another notable work important to this topic from the perspective that U.S. dominance will not decline comes from the research of Stephen G. Brooks and William C. Woolforth. This study suggests a different approach in analyzing polarity and argues that polarity itself is useful for comparative measures, but falls short in assessing future projections and changes within the system. Declinists such as Paul Kennedy and Christopher Lane have taken different approaches in demonstrating their assessments of U.S. decline. Kennedy takes an approach correlating military and economic strength and feels that the United States will follow a pattern of previous great powers, with research going back as far as 1500. Lane approaches the subject from a middle ground, not necessarily outrightly stating that the U.S. is set for an inevitable decline, but rather that the common arguments for the perpetuation of U.S. dominance are weak, and that the world is advancing in favor of other states, which will create a multipolar system. The thesis will be focused around common arguments between primicists and declinists. Declinists rely on imperial overstretch theory, which falls in line with realism, namely that the United States has reached a point where defending its unipolar position has plateaued. It cannot necessarily add to its own power without causing an international incident, as other states feel that it may be encroaching on their sovereign power, but at the same time, holding on to its current position is economically impossible to maintain without new acquisition of capital and wealth. Primicists do not necessarily argue this point. Krauthammer even cites it as the reason for the inevitable end to U.S. primacy, a domestic economic problem. But they argue that it is a problem for future generations to deal with, and that the primacy will last for decades. For Krauthammer in 1990, this meant about 30 years, which we have reached. However, primacist works between 2010 and 2020 cite primacy well beyond 2020. They argue that states are unable to balance power with the United States because they lack the economic strength or military capability. Primicists also argue that many states benefit from the United States as the global hegemon and that they are not threatened by it but rather welcome the status quo because it deters other threatening powers from rising. However, one aspect that these declinists have most notably failed to analyze in depth is the significance of the US dollar as the international reserve currency. Declinists provide economic and military connections to the US's power status. Primicists counter with dominance theories of their own from the basis of global dependency of the US and the lack of a viable international state competitor. However, both these theories discount and overlook the importance of the advantageous position the US has had on the international economic system due to its reliance on the dollar, as well as the disadvantageous position for states in their reliance on the dollar. Despite the lack of debate regarding the dollar within the unipolar discussion, it is reasonable to conclude that both schools of thought most likely did not predict the extent of the current state of the U.S. economy, nor the enormity of the debt the U.S. has taken on since the main declinist literature was written in 1987 and 1993. This research will rely on declinist quantitative data, most especially the work done by Paul Kennedy. The thesis will aim to prove that predictions of U.S. decline made during the final bipolar era and shortly after were not false. Rather, the claims were merely too early. The basis of the argument should prove correct. Incorporating U.S. economic data from 1991 to 2020 should hopefully also paint a picture as to why exactly the U.S. was able to successfully evade decline for so many years, most especially upon examination of Federal Reserve interest rate data, U.S. Treasury bonds, U.S. GDP, national debt, and the value of the dollar.